and welcome once again to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg, and I'm joined on the mic, as always, by my co-host and co-producer, Calvin Pollock. And we are extraordinarily excited today to be rejoined, in fact, by Dr. Derek G. Handley, an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and also an emeritus and founding member of Reverb. It's great to have him back. Derek now teaches courses on urban rhetorics, argumentation, writing pedagogy, and African American studies. And his new book, which is going to be released probably around the time that this episode drops, is titled Struggle for the City: Rhetorics of Citizenship and Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement. Derek, welcome back to Reverb. It's great to be with you again.
Oh, I am so happy to be back. I was just curious, am I one of the first repeat guests, or have you all had guests come
We've
back
had,
before?
we've had only our favorites return.
It's good to be back after 6 years, I think it was, since my first visit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is amazing to have you back, Derek. And yeah, thinking back to that last conversation, when we last spoke to you, we focused a lot on what was then your dissertation research, right? On the rhetorics of
Correct.
African American resistance to urban renewal policies and practices in Pittsburgh in the mid 20th century. Obviously, we all went to grad school together in Pittsburgh. It's very close to our hearts, and we're so excited to learn more about how you're expanding that project in the book. So you've expanded the scope to comparatively analyze resistance movements to urban renewal in two other cities in the American North, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so we wanted, before we get into those case studies, to just sort of have you educate our listeners about the exigency for these movements that were going on at the same time, which really was a massive policy change involving housing in the 40s and 50s through acts like the Housing Act of 1949 and 1954 and the Highway Act of 1956, as well as a bunch of local and statewide initiatives. So you write about what you call the master narrative in these policies. Why do you call that a master narrative? And what were some of the most notable rhetorical features of the master narrative of urban renewal?
So thanks for that question. When I first began the project, I was just, solely focusing on Pittsburgh, which is my hometown in the Hill District, where a lot of African Americans live, and was adversely affected by urban renewal, and doing a deep dive on that based on some advice I received from my friend and mentor, Kurt Wilson at Penn State, to perhaps look at some other cities as well. And once I started doing that, and I looked at several others, of course, I chose Milwaukee and St. Paul, but I noticed there was a common theme, if you will, where all these other cities have places like the Hill District, as well as recalling what was done. And when you grow up in a particular area, you think it's just something that happens to you locally, but this was, again, nationally. Like when I was growing up as a kid, I used to hear family members talking about, the lower hill and how things used to be. And my naive thinking was like, well, if this was such a wonderful place or have such fond memories, why did y'all let them tear it down? Right? That's coming from a place of naivete. And so I started investigating. I started looking to these questions in these communities. Milwaukee, you have Brownsville, and folks talk about Brownsville the same way they're talking about the Hill District. And then I go up to St. Paul or the Twin Cities, in the same thing about the Rondo neighborhood. I could have chose Seattle. I could have chose Seattle. I could have chose Hartford, Connecticut, where you two are. Folks are telling me, and as I'm talking about my project, folks are telling me similar things across the nation: North Carolina, Miami, Florida. But I tend to focus on the northern cities because Pittsburgh was one of the earliest cities to take advantage of the Housing Act, where they got federal dollars. And I call this the master narrative because this language, began at the federal government level, And then it came down to the state, and then of course the cities. So the federal government, same in Milwaukee, same elsewhere, and other cities started referencing, like Milwaukee referenced Pittsburgh several times in some of their projects. So is this master narrative that's being repeated? And of course, one thing that we often hear in urban environments is the word blight and the power of this metaphor. And so for these cities to get access to federal dollars, certain neighborhoods had to be designated as blighted. And once that happens, then they get the federal dollars, eminent domain, about the properties, and they could clear it out. So the power of that metaphor, and you see it in federal hearings, which I write about. Then you see it in the state and local governments, and then at the local level. And so what does that mean? And the bright metaphor gets used so much, sometimes we forget about the original meaning in terms of, plants and things like that. Blight has now been associated with urban environments. Well, when you got disease, what do you want to do? You want to get rid of it. So that is the way which I was thinking about this use of master narrative and how something gets repeated over and over and over and over again. The effects that has and how people start to believe that narrative.
Yeah, I think we wanted to just linger on the blight metaphor and the kind of, the ways that this was marshaled largely by, as you said, the federal government, and then repeated, recontextualized by state and local officials. And just it's such a kind of pernicious, covert way to mask what was essentially a racist policy on the ground level, right? That this is a way to kind of, dress up the language of race using a nature metaphor. Could you talk a little bit more about the ways that you're approaching this, kind of thinking about the use of metaphors like the blight metaphor, and specifically the role that played in the urban environments that were, increasingly experiencing a migration of specifically African Americans from the Jim Crow South, and why that was kind of, significant to be using that kind of language around that time?
Right. There's been a whole lot of work done about disease metaphors and immigration. But in this particular case, and I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on Pittsburgh in the beginning, which, like I said, was one of the first cities to take advantage of this. I do not want to idolize or romanticize the lower hill. I want to be very careful. Basically, a lot of these neighborhoods in which African Americans were living in tended to be older, not only older, but dilapidated in some cases. So there were some buildings that probably need to be redone. And the homeowners, a lot of African Americans were renting, and the homeowners weren't fixing them up. So there were some problems there. But not every building, not every business that was located in these areas would fall under this idea of blight. But one of the powers of the master narrative, and this is one of the reasons why I concentrated in northern cities, we're talking about in 1954, 55, 56, really, in the Housing Act in 1949. This is like just before or at the very beginning of what we now know as the civil rights movement. And so what you have, especially in Pittsburgh, is that there were a lot of citizens who thought of urban renewal was going to be a good thing for them. And because they were going to get, more affordable housing. So urban renewal was just going to, tear down the old housing and build up new housing. They saw it initially as a benefit to the community. And as it went on, then they realized what was happening and said, wait a second, to draw on that famous refrain and that James Baldwin also iterated, urban renewal meant Negro removal, to use a term. And so it became clear that this master narrative of blight not only was in reference to the buildings and the dilapidations, but in some ways it was about the people themselves. If there's Black people in this area, in this community, and I'm now thinking about the work I'm doing now on racist housing covenants, because there's Black people there, it's blighted. So that is to your point, Alex, about the racial narrative, how this master narrative was racist, and African Americans who were trying to counteract this idea of blight or organizing this clean up the block campaigns and beautify the neighborhood and stuff. And maybe if we do this, then our houses or our businesses wouldn't be teared down. But there was nothing they could have done because the neighborhood was targeted, it was labeled, and then the bulldozers came.
Yeah, it's incredibly sobering to think about the use of that kind of language and the ways that, as you said, there was this initial idea that, if it's just referring to the houses, if it's just referring to the streets, like, well, this is something that we as a community can come together, clean up the streets and whatnot. But that inevitably, the real impetus behind this project becomes very clear
Right.
through the actual explicit removal of residents in favor of building sports arenas, museums, highways that are essentially going to use the powers of the federal government to take away people's homes. One other high level concept that we wanted to introduce, though, from your book as a way of, providing a counter to this master narrative
Right.
is what you call Black rhetorical citizenship. This is kind of the key conceptual thread that runs through all of your case studies, which you use to describe this diverse array of rhetorical strategies that African Americans used as a mode of public engagement, going beyond, as you say, quote, specific moments of individual agency, such as voting. This is not just about individual people taking action, but sort of a larger assemblage of rhetorical strategies. So what would you say if you had to distill it down into something kind of bite-sized? What are some of the features of Black rhetorical citizenship as you conceive of it? And why is this concept so helpful for studying the history of African American social movement rhetorics as not only this kind of oppositional and counter-hegemonic force to the very real threats facing African American communities throughout history, but also as a kind of affirmative world-making project that constitutes norms for civic life?
Man, what a brilliant question, Alex. And what I really want to say is, I don't know. This was the part of the book I struggled with. This was the part of the dissertation that I've been thinking a lot about. To get back to what I was referencing about answering the question is why didn't people stop it? What I noticed in a lot of the urban renewal scholarship was the narrative was just being told from the top down. The archives have the governmental papers and mayor's decisions and speeches and stuff like that about urban renewal. So there's always the stories told from the perspective of the government and what has happened to Black people. It's like they're writing about Black people and writing to Black people, but we're not hearing the Black voice. So what I wanted to do with this book, I mean, I felt like I could wrote a whole book about the master narrative. I mean, the archives were filled with documents about the ways in which, language was flowing down from government officials to newspapers to op-eds, and I touched on that a little bit. But what were Black people thinking? What were Black people saying? And I wanted to be as close to the dates that these events were occurring as possible. Not necessarily of, looking back. Oral histories gave me a lot, but they also were a map, if you will, to where to look for different things in newspaper accounts and things like that. So I use the frame Black rhetorical citizenship in two ways. So number one, I'm drawing from this collected edition on rhetorical citizenship that was put together by Koch and Valetzen, and in the ways in which they were thinking about rhetorical citizenship. And I kind of draw from that this is this umbrella term. It's a larger term. It's the ways in which folks are organizing and deliberating under this umbrella of citizenship that we tend to think about in terms of rhetoric. But what I felt was missing, I shouldn't say not missing, but what I felt wasn't given voice is some of these traditional notions of citizenship and places of deliberation has to be thought about differently when you're talking about Black people, right? when you got segregated communities, you're not going to be walking down the street and bump into the mayor or the city council person because you didn't have any representation there. You're being segregated from, the country clubs or whatever the private university club is in the city. You weren't in the places where decisions were being made, right? So there's a spatial dynamic. We had to think about place when we're talking about citizenship for people of color. So there's a space component or a place component. The other thing too that I was thinking, and you can look at whether it's the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black people use this phrase, we want to be treated as first class citizens, the second class citizenship, right? So this invoking of citizenship as part of the struggle, as part of the language, the resistance, right? And the other common word is freedom. The freedom to live where you want to live, to buy a house where you want to buy, the freedom to be left alone by the police, right? So it's a collection of things. So it gave me an umbrella in which to talk about rhetorics of place and also the ways in which the rhetorical traditions African Americans use within the Black freedom movement, right? How were they organizing? What was being said? How was it being said? How was it being used? And the allies to create it. When you talk about any struggle, any successful struggle of movements, there's going to be allies. So the urban renewal situation provided an opportunity to think about it like that and to learn, even though there were some situations where, the communities were not successful, but there still was a lot to learn and to draw from it.
Yeah, for sure. That's really helpful, I think, for understanding the kind of conceptual framework of Black rhetorical citizenship. And I think we wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into the point you made about giving voice to the Black perspective on it, because as you said, there can be, if you focus only on these government documents and these
Right,
master narratives, it
right,
becomes this kind of like all-consuming hegemony that, there's kind of no, the term you use in your book is counterstory, right?
right,
The counterstory that
right.
Black citizens were developing and using. And so you write about, in the case of Pittsburgh, they were opposing the construction of the Civic Arena sports complex, or not even necessarily opposing it, would you say, but like wanting a particular kind of form for that project to take that included affordable housing and other kinds of things, but that ultimately, as you said, in a lot of cases, these master narratives were successful because the policies were enacted. Like many
Hmm.
homes were demolished in the Lower Hill District. Many
Oh,
people were
yes,
displaced to other
yes.
parts of Pittsburgh. But nevertheless, as you say, there's a kind of success in the counter story being retold and in this kind of longer term rhetorical effect of the counter story. So, what was the role of the counter story just in the Pittsburgh case to start?
Sure. And Pittsburgh in many ways was the same in the other cities. But in this desire to find the Black voice in real time, it goes without saying the biggest benefit to this work was the Black newspaper, right? And now that's like my refrain. Anytime when anyone's talking about some project that they're doing on Black people, I ask them, are you looking at the Black newspapers? You know, because that was an outlet, that was a place where the Black voice was being heard. And so in the case of Pittsburgh, when I'm doing this research and reading, I'm seeing all these narratives of what the lower hill was like and how it was used and how can they be tearing it down. The lower hill was not a slum. It shouldn't always be thought of as a slum. There's a long, proud history here. But
And
that
these
get
these narratives, sorry to cut you off there, but
sure.
these narratives were told in the Pittsburgh Courier,
The
right?
Pittsburgh, thank you for that. Yes, the Pittsburgh Courier, and folks are writing in letters to the editor, op-ed pieces. what is happening to these people. So you have these counter stories to, the blight, that these places are not worth saving. So what I am suggesting is reading about those, and if I may use, sort of, to draw on Royster's term, critical imagination, I would imagine as you're reading this, it's galvanizing, right? What is happening to the lower hill now, what's going to happen to the middle? We need to organize. We need to put a stop, because we know the histories of these places. So the counter stories I'm suggesting was unifying these communities and help with organizers, because they're saving their businesses. They're trying to save churches. Churches were torn down. Matter of fact, the church in Pittsburgh now, I think it's Bethel AME, was torn down. Their original building was torn down in Lower Hill. And I heard a presentation from the current preacher now about how, I don't want to say illegal, but it wasn't supposed to be done. And so now they, for lack of a better term, have started receiving reparations and making some changes. So in the real times, like, this is the narrative, and this is part of the urban renewal story that was getting often looked. And the other thing that I am suggesting, again, this is 1956, 57. What's going on during this time in other places, right? Martin Luther King is doing his thing down in the Deep South. So I was like, well, there is a civil rights movement happening in the northern cities as well, in real time. And when I was teaching at the community college in Pittsburgh, I can ask my students about the civil rights movement. And what are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about local history in Montgomery, Alabama. They're going to talk about local history in Birmingham, right? But they can't tell me about the civil rights movement in Pittsburgh. And the same in Milwaukee. It's gotten better now, same in the Twin Cities. So I wanted to highlight people. These aren't nationally known. We don't have, great speeches, but they were people who saw a problem, who were organizing, and they were trying to solve this problem, if you will. I'm getting a
Yeah.
little preachy, so I'm going to stop there. But this was
How
important
dare
to
you
me.
be preachy about something
And
like
I'm not a
this?
preacher. I'm not a preacher. My
No,
good
no,
friend
no.
Andre Johnson is one, but I am not a preacher.
Well, no, I think that you're getting at what's so important about surfacing this counter story and giving it its due, because I think one of the really fascinating things about your analysis is that you highlight these moments of rhetoric that, as you said, they're not great speeches. They didn't
Right.
maybe circulate nationally as much, but they nevertheless had a huge impact locally in Pittsburgh, and they're still referenced in Black Lives Matter discourse,
Yes.
locally in Pittsburgh and other kinds of local organizing efforts. One of those is the Freedom Corner, and specifically the billboard that was constructed
Mm.
about Freedom Corner and some of the visual rhetoric around that. I wonder if you could just tell our listeners a little bit about, first of all, what was that example? And then second of all, more broadly, how visual rhetoric plays into your account of the counter story.
Sure. So Freedom Corner, this is the origin stories of the project. This was I first started writing about the Freedom Corner. So a corner in Pittsburgh, center in Crawford, was this place where several African American groups put up a billboard in the 60s saying there will be no redevelopment beyond this point. Civic Arena had already been built, the destruction of the lower hill, and that was just supposed to be one part of moving into the traditional African American neighborhood of the Hill District. And I think I used a phrase in the article I wrote, a line of demarcation, and they were trying to save the rest of their neighborhood. So that had become the rallying cry for this neighborhood. And then in the early 2000s, the land was bought, and a memorial up to the Pittsburgh Civil Rights Movement was built. And if you're ever in Pittsburgh, I highly suggest and go take a look. But as I said in the article, it was designed as a rhetorical space. So it's a place for protest. even though it's highlighting the folks who made a difference in the Pittsburgh civil rights movement. There's like a little raised platform where you can hold protests and where the speaker is talking to folks, and you got the city in the background. So it's a rhetorical place, which I think is very unique.
Just to quickly interject
Sure.
here, this was also a location you took your students at CCAC,
I did.
College
I
of Allegheny
did.
County. Did you want to share a little bit about that as kind of like a
Sure. Well, you know what? This is a Pittsburgh love fest here. The plays of August Wilson, 9 of his 10 plays are set in Pittsburgh. So I was taking my students, we were doing a walking tour with a niece of August Wilson, and that was our meeting spot. And when we met there, we were waiting for the tour guide. And I think I wrote about this in the intro. This car drove past, and this woman, rolled down her window. She was in the passenger seat and yelled out, "We are still slaves." And this was kind of like the origins project. It was like, what, wait, what? Why are you saying that? We're just standing here. But this shows you the rhetorical power of this corner and what it represents, and this feeling like, okay, we might have had this victory, but we're still being targeted. So I can't remember where this was in the chronological process of writing the book, but all of this was kind of feeding to why this particular place in Pittsburgh is generating this sort of reaction. But the other thing too, I want to point out, I want to give a shout out to the Homewood Brushton campus of CCAC where I taught. It was also helpful for them to see a couple things. Now I'm going to shift into the writing pedagogy thing here. When we're reading August Wilson and reading words in the ways in which they talk and seeing themselves reflected. And then with the Freedom Corner, and we're talking about the Freedom Corner, and when we're talking about writing, we always say, oh, you can make a difference, and, write a letter to the editor, or write your Congress. We have now real world examples to show you how, whether it's maybe your grandparents or something like that, who are just ordinary citizens who got together and they were joining their local chapter of the NAACP or the local version of the Black Panther Party, because whether you're a believer in the Black Panthers or Martin Luther King, that bulldozer is tearing both your houses down. It didn't matter. So to show them that there might be a situation where you have to stand up, you have to draw upon some of your gifts, some of your resources, some of your rhetorical gifts to help to make change. So I think that's the benefit from a pedagogical perspective. But to get back to your question, Alex, the Freedom Corner has that power, has that resonance within the community to the point today it's still being used as a meeting place to lead off marches. And it's not just Black causes. I think I talked about this in the last interview. Oh gosh, I drew a blank on the economic protests.
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street, yes. And then of course the Black Lives Matter movement or any unjust police killings, that has become a site of protest.
Yeah, and you're highlighting here, and your book does even further kind of archival work, uncovering some of the other specifically visual materials. Like there was a map of the Hill District, I think, that you wrote about that was circulated there too, that really just emphasizes the role of place in this mode of Black rhetorical citizenship that you're talking about. That helps people kind of re-envision or reimagine what the future of a space might look like, or what it should look like, what it compels people to do in that space, which I think is a really powerful way of thinking about a counter story as something that's not just about the tropes that you invoke or the way that you speak, but also the way that you use multi-modality to give people a sense of where they are and what that space could be. So
right.
I wanted to move into here. One thing that we didn't really get a chance to talk about quite as much on our last podcast was the role that highway construction played in urban renewal struggles in the North. This is one where I think, as you mentioned before, this is one where you're starting to hear these kind of eerie resonances where it's like, oh yeah, now I've also noticed that the major superhighway or the viaduct or whatever it is that's going through all of these different northern cities, as you mentioned, and as I said to you prior to the show, that, Hartford is kind of where I'm teaching and where I'm
Yes.
located, also had a predominantly Black neighborhood that was, cut off from the rest of its downtown by the construction of Interstate 84. That also facilitated white flight and kind of gutted the economic center of the city. But in your book, you talk about this predominantly, actually, in a place that I'm also familiar with, having grown up in the Twin Cities suburbs. My parents drove me on I-94 all the time.
All the time.
And I had never quite had the opportunity to put it together, the significance of the places where that highway was running through. So can you talk about some of the ways that this, the master narrative of urban renewal is being marshaled in these highway policies following the U.S. Highway Act of 1956, specifically in the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul? And what were some of the tactics that citizens, groups, and coalitions like the Rondo St. Anthony Improvement Association were using to try and counter that rhetoric?
Yes, I think this has probably been the largest gain in understanding since we last spoke. The Highway Construction Act, 1956, had a lot of the same features as the Housing Act of 54, except less money. A matter of fact, I think it was no money was provided for relocating residents. And just another point of comparison, the African American community in Pittsburgh, I would argue, was larger and perhaps had more financial resources than Milwaukee and St. Paul. So their initial reactions to these highways was, okay, we have to have open housing, right? Again, this is prior to 1968, the Housing Act. We want to be able to live wherever we want. Let's go back to housing covenants. Let's go back to redlining. You got these large concentrations of African Americans in these urban central areas, right? Because of housing discrimination. They couldn't live anywhere. And they didn't have the government power really to make substantive changes. So now you have these highways. Now, where are we going to put these highways? Are we going to put them in your neighborhood, Councilman Bob? Are we going to put it in your neighborhood? So, you got these Black communities right there. And so there is case after case after case where the highway would go straight down the main thoroughfare of these African American communities, and Rondo in particular, and split it. Because where the highway is, was usually like the larger streets where these Black businesses were. And so what happened to the Black businesses? What happens to the Black wealth? Are they then going to relocate into, a white suburban neighborhood? No, usually it's going to be gone. So in the case of Rondo, and I trace back when they first caught wind of what was going to happen and how are they organizing. And you had a preacher and a barber who were voted to be the leaders of this organization. And what I like about that, because these are non-traditional sites of deliberation for African Americans. Matter of fact, churches were often where folks will meet in general to talk about community issues because they had a larger space. And then, of course, you got the barbershop or case of women, hair salon and stuff, more informal deliberation. But the barber in a Black community is the entrepreneur, is the businessman. It was a perfect example. So in that part of the chapter, I'm looking at the ways in which African Americans are thinking about leadership and organizing and deliberation, how they are trying to, use whatever resources they could in order to stop the building of the highway. And I talk about number one, it was like, can we stop it? Number two, can we reroute it? There's another route. Can we get open house? Can we live wherever we want? And then the final one, the lesser of all the evils, and it was evil, at least they were able to depress it. So at some point, if they wanted to be able to create a bridge, a land bridge or something across, they could. But there was no way they were going to be able to stop it. And Alex, I'm curious about Hartford. Is that where the predominant African American population is in the state, or is it elsewhere? Do you know offhand?
I mean, I don't have the demographic statistics right in front of me. Anecdotally, I can say that so Hartford is probably one of the most diverse cities in the state of Connecticut, closely followed by Waterbury and Bridgeport. Primarily, I would say Caribbean diaspora coming up from New York City, but also a
Okay.
lot of Afro-Caribbean diaspora as well. That's where a lot of, I believe, the city's African American or black and brown population comes from, is
Okay.
from Afro-Caribbean roots. But predominantly, I mean, there was also, Hartford was also an area that, because we had tobacco fields
Right.
here, one of those cities in the north that was growing tobacco, also had, kind of like, experienced an influx from the Great Migration. And as a result, especially because the tobacco fields were north of the city of Hartford, a lot of the north end neighborhoods that were cut off from the rest of downtown, that were kind of bisected with almost surgical precision from the city. Literally the plan, or at least the model after which the official plan was drawn up, was literally authored by Robert Moses, one of the more
Yes.
infamous
Oh,
architects
yes.
of
Oh,
urban
yes.
renewal, redlining, and all these other practices. So, I mean,
Right.
that is, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, not to go on a rant there, but that's
That's
what I know,
okay.
at least about
I
Hartford.
was asking because it was by design. I mean, I quote the scholar in a book, and I can't think of his name right now, talking about Minnesota. And he says, there's not very many black people in Minnesota, but the highways found them, So I talk primarily about Rondo, but south of Minneapolis, near where George Floyd was murdered. So it was so easy for government officials to lay out these highways, right? Because you're not valuing black people. Eddie Glaude calls it a value gap. So if you're not valuing black people, you're not valuing their communities. You only see them as blight. And in the case of Minnesota, the black neighborhood was a little bit too close to the capital neighborhood and stuff. So the highway was used as a way to so-called clear out black blighted areas. But again, as we said at the beginning, we could talk about that narrative, but I wanted to make sure is what were people doing? How are they organizing to stop against it? And because of that organization, because of that rhetorical history, you see that being drawn upon today within the Black freedom movement, as well as the memories of what happened. It still gets invoked when they're arguing over current policies.
Yeah, and just quickly on that note of talking about the resistance to it, do you want to just give us a tiny preview of who Reverend George Davis was in that struggle, and what role did he play in the resistance?
Sure. So I want to make sure I clarify that the leaders of the movement in St. Paul was Reverend Floyd Massey, and then a barber was Tim Howard. Now, Reverend George Davis was a private citizen. He was actually running a church out of his house, if I have the story correct. And he was part of the Great Migration coming up from Texas. Him and his wife, had lived in this house for decades. Decades. And this story is being retold by his grandson in the oral history project. But you also have documentation in the newspapers when it happened. And basically, he wasn't going to leave. He was one of the last people to leave his house. He didn't want to leave. So what did he do? He got his shotgun. And I think the year is important because we associate the Black Power in the late 60s and their weapons and stuff like that. 56, we're still, we're on the tail end of the Montgomery bus boycott and nonviolence. And he is standing his ground and saying, essentially, this is my home. I am not leaving. Right? Because what did they have for him? Because the area was under rumor of being torn down, they couldn't get any loans to increase property values. They couldn't sell the house. So he was basically was going to be moved into an apartment. Now, this is your home, right? Minnesota was your destination coming from the deeply segregated South. You have this square piece of land in the world that is yours, and you've lived there. And now these folks are coming to take it away. And he wasn't going to go. So you had to stand off. There was no violence. There was no shooting. They eventually got him to leave and put him in a car. I think he was in his 80s when this happened. And his grandson says that his grandfather only lived like another year after that because he was heartbroken. But that often gets revoked as part of the critical memory of Rondo. That gets invoked, over current discussions or current policies. So that story gets told and retold. And anytime you hear that story, it brings up emotions, it brings up feelings and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's the story of Reverend Davis, which I find fascinating and heartbreaking.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think that this gets a little bit towards the topic that we wanted to close with in our conversation with you today, which is about some work you've been doing that's related to this book project, but is also a more of a public scholarship
Hmm.
project about racist housing covenants in
Yes.
Milwaukee. And I just before we go there, I wanted to mention that as I was preparing for this conversation, I did a little bit of research into Seattle, the city I'm living
Oh,
in.
yes.
And there is a predominantly Black neighborhood really close to where I live now. So the neighborhood is Central District. And I, as I've been getting settled in here, it's really been reminding me a lot of the Hill District in Pittsburgh. It just has a very similar feel. And I was kind of like, what is the backstory here? And that caused me to research not only the history of the Central District. The main thing I took away from that is that there was a very similar highway project that was introduced, successfully defeated by local Black community groups in coalition with some university stakeholders, because the university here is pretty close to the Central District as well. And it would have affected the Arboretum, which is this massive public park that a lot of people use. And so it was successfully defeated, but the property developers and government officials still, I hate to use the term succeeded, but succeeded in emptying the neighborhood of the Black population significantly. I mean, Black population is down to about 18% now, and it was
Hmm.
something like 60% before the highway plans were introduced, right? And one of the other things that I learned in doing some of this just casual research was that there were many, many racist housing covenants that even in like neighborhoods very close to where I live that would have restricted me for being half Jewish, anti-Jewish housing covenants, anti-Asian and anti-Black housing covenants. There's a public scholarship project at the University of Washington looking into this that we'll link to in the show notes. But you've been working on a project at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee on racist housing covenants in Milwaukee.
Hmm.
And so tell us a little bit about that project and how it affected the book, and also how your work on the book has been affecting your approach to this project.
Sure. So, I hadn't really known much about covenants until I was writing the book. And I think I kind of heard about them in passing. So when I was writing the book, I found very useful some of the work of urban and human geography. And there was one particular article about Milwaukee that was written by Ann Bonds and another scholar. And I come to find out that Ann Bonds was here at UWM when I got hired. So I reached out to her And this was probably January of 2020. And so we met and had coffee. It's hard to remember things before the pandemic. I said, your article about the zip code in Milwaukee, about how the zip code is used as a stigma for Black people. And I was joking with her. I said, this is really a rhetoric article that you wrote here as a geography. And then as I started reading more about geography and reading some of their articles, it's like, wait a second, I think I'm a rhetorician writing geography articles. So she was just started doing some work on these covenants. And I thought it was an interesting project. And I said, okay, I would like to hear more about it at some time. Again, I was going to be new faculty. I was getting settled. Of course, the pandemic hit. And then, George Floyd was murdered. And we all know how we all reacted to that. And I was trying to think about what could I do as a scholar. What could I do as a scholar? I felt like I needed to do something. Everybody wanted to do something. Everybody had their own ways, and I wanted to do something as a scholar. And I remember her project, and I reached out to her. And I started learning more about covenants. And at that time, it was called Mapping Racism in Milwaukee County. And I said to her, I said, I think this is only half the story, though. We can't just talk about the racism. We also got to talk about the Black people, because this is something Black people has always known. We knew what neighborhoods we couldn't live in. We knew what areas to stay away, especially after dark. And so I wanted to make sure that we gave voice to the folks who were fighting against it. And so that's how this project developed, Mapping Racism and Resistance in Milwaukee County. I'm happy to say that we got an NEH grant back in January to fund this digital project. So basically, racist covenants, from early 20th century, over half of the houses and properties that white people lived in had these racist housing covenants. When you buy a house, you sign all these papers, the deeds, and it's written right into the deeds.
I was going to say, I have a quote right here.
Sure.
If you want, this is the one from the Washington Highlands section of Wauwatosa that you quote
Go,
from.
Go ahead and read it.
At no time shall the land included in Washington Highlands or any part thereof or any building thereon be purchased, owned, leased, or occupied by any person other than of white race. This prohibition is not intended to include domestic servants while employed by the owner or occupied and land included in the tract.
Think about that.
Insane.
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
Think about that. Think about that. And this was in the deeds. Your fence can only be this high, your garage only can be this wide, and no people of color. Only those folks of the white race. In this language, and it's all throughout. Now, Calvin, you talk about Seattle. I imagine there was a lot more that were stating about Asian Americans.
Yes, there's a huge number of anti-Asian racist
They're
housing covenants.
These deeds are crafted to their audience. I'm using rhetoric language now. Here in Milwaukee, also, there was some targeting Jewish people. Milwaukee has a large Hispanic population that started coming as early as like the 1920s, 1930s. There were some that specifically said no Mexicans. Also, I've seen some here in Milwaukee actually said no Italians, right? Before Italians became white, there were some that said no Italians, or you had to be.
You can learn about the process of racialization by studying these as well.
Yes, the process of race. And then there were some, of course, you had to be an American citizen. So this is all throughout. And even after they became non-enforceable in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer, they were still being used because they thought that was going to get overturned. So this is our project. We're about 75% complete in transcribing these. And we're going to build a website. But we're also part of a coalition because, again, this is everywhere. And in the coalition, we got DC people, we got Chicago people. I think we got represented in Seattle. Mapping Prejudice out of Minnesota, University of Minnesota, who's one of our partners. who was very helpful to us in our project, was one of the first using a particular process that we're using. So we're part of this coalition, and it's very interesting for those of us who like language and study language, seeing the nuances and seeing the differences. But as I was saying before, how are Black people responding? And one particular thing that we're working on an article now was about the Halyards, who started the Columbia Savings and Loan, which is still in business today. They started it in 1926, and it was founded in part in response to these housing covenants. And so, the book that I wrote, to use a Star Wars metaphor, is episode 4. Right. So we got to go back. We got to go back because these covenants were used to help draw redlining maps. So when you get to the 50s and 60s, why, I like to ask my students, I said, do you ever wonder why are there Black neighborhoods? Why are there Black neighborhoods? Well, this was by design. And so when you got people segregated and hemmed in, to use a phrase from a Langston Hughes poem about racial covenants, hemmed in, then it's easy. Then you got, for lack of a better word, you got a map in which to put your highways. Connect the dots, if you will.
Yep.
And so that's why you have these similar stories. And because just like Black communities are talking to each other, mayors are talking to each other, governors are talking to each. How did you do urban renewal? How did you think about highway construction? And a lot of these plans and these ideas, in the case of Minnesota, they were mapped out as early as the 40s, even before the money became available. So I'm working on a project with some scholars in Minnesota about the Minnesota highways. So I've learned a lot. Matter of fact, I was chastised for keep using the word highways when I was talking about Minnesota. I shouldn't say chastised, but freeways. I learned the difference between freeways and highways. So when I'm talking about St. Paul, let me say freeways. Greg and Dr. Lloyd, if you're listening. So that aspect has been very fascinating in how it go hand in hand and how these things are, they're connected, if you will.
I mean, speaking of connection too, I mean, one of the things that to me is so inspiring and honestly invigorating hearing you talk about this work that you've been doing in a coalition with other universities and other scholars, as well as members of the Black community in Milwaukee, is that it echoes so much of what you talk about in your book of these, the leadership summits that were organized by scholars at Marquette and UW Milwaukee in the past to help, train people in things like public speaking or to, kind of help this groundswell of Black rhetorical citizenship and all the different ways that people are trying to enact that and to deliberate, to distribute agency, as you write, among one another. It also is so useful, I think, to kind of, just draw a point to that last chapter that you have in the book about the role of memory in all of this.
Oh gosh, know what? I'm thinking about how the book all came together, and I deliberately was trying to stay away from memory. Right?
Why is that?
I mean, it was like, this is a rhetorical history book. I'm doing rhetorical history, and then I get to the, I was like, I have to do memory. I mean, especially within communication scholarship or just rhetoric scholarship in general, public memory is this large field. I say I could do a whole book on master narrative. I could do a whole book on that last chapter, right? I mean, the scope. This is one of those things. You got 3 different cities and 3 different scenarios, and that was the constant battle. But in trying to do the research about what was happening in the 50s and 60s, I kept seeing how what happened in the 50s and 60s were influencing conversations today. And, first it was the Freedom Corner. Well, guess what? In Rondo, they have the Rondo Plaza, right? And the mayor getting up there and apologizing for what's happening. So what is happening is still having an effect today in the ways in which Black people or these communities are going to remember it might be different than a public memory. So that's how that was like the last chapter actually I wrote and came to. And I'm really proud of that chapter. My friend and colleague, Sarah Vanderhagen, helped me because she wrote a lot about memory, and I was workshopped it in one of her grad classes and helped me to think about it. So and I thanked a lot of people in the book, so I'm not going to go through the whole list. But that chapter, I think, really brought it together. When you're thinking about history, and my wife, who's a historian, and accusing me of want to be a historian, thinking about changes over time, right? And I think that chapter kind of brings that part together. So that's how I was thinking about critical memory. That's something a little bit different than public memory. Folks, when they're driving down a highway, there's a story about this one woman here in Milwaukee. She won't drive down I-43 because she's like, I'm driving through my bedroom as a little girl. You know what I'm saying? So things like that you don't think about. We just, Alex, you touched on it. We just take advantage or we take for granted that these highways are here. We don't think about how they got here and what becomes so. But for some people, those wounds will never close.
Well, and it's something that is so important for all of us to remember, even if it was something that we once took for granted.
Right.
I will never look at that section of I-94 the same way ever again, in the same way that I won't look at I-84 ever again after learning about its construction. And I mean, I just want to say, I really think there's a real palpable value in the work that scholars like you are doing and the people that you're partnering with, because it not only is preserving that memory, it's also providing a scaffold to people in the present who are looking around and really trying to figure out what are strategies for resistance? What are the things that people in the past have done? How can we analyze them to see what kinds of rhetorical responses are good for not only resisting, but also for cultivating those norms of citizenship, of, forming an actual social collective that can act together, which is, I think, what all the case studies in your book do a really brilliant job of illustrating. So without giving too much of it away, I feel like that's the sizzle line for you got to go out and buy Derek's book right now, because
do it.
Well, thank you for that high praise. I really appreciate it. And, it was a labor of love, and I forced myself to look at it again in preparation for this conversation, and it's so hard because I want to revise, because you read so much and you think so much about some things, and sometimes you just gotta say, "Oh, it's out in the world. You gotta let it go."
You got to save that for your Star Wars prequel series.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. There we go.
Oh, man. Well, Derek, it has been an absolute pleasure having you back with us here on Reverb. For everyone else out there, the book is called Struggle for the City. The author, Dr. Derek G. Handley. We want to thank you once again, Derek, for being with us. It has been a total joy to talk to you.
This was awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you both.
Absolutely. And from the rest of us here at Reverb, take care, everyone, and we'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, and tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.